For 3 months, I said nothing. I cooked dinner, I shoveled the driveway, I smiled when they walked past me in my own hallway, and the whole time I already knew exactly what was coming for them. My name is Colin. I'm 67 years old. I spent 32 years working as a structural engineer for a firm in Hamilton, Ontario. I built bridges, I reviewed load-bearing plans for hospitals and schools, I helped design 2 overpasses on the 401. I was not a man who made emotional decisions. I was a man who looked at the structure of a thing and figured out where it was going to fail. That's probably why I saw it coming before my son did. But let me go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened, you need to understand what that house meant to me. My wife and I bought the property in 2001. It was a century-old farmhouse on 2 acres outside of Guelph, about 40 minutes from the city. The bones were good. Original hardwood floors, a stone fireplace in the living room, 4 bedrooms upstairs, and the finished basement my wife turned into a craft room. We spent 10 years fixing it up ourselves, weekends and holidays. I redid the electrical. She replanted the garden from scratch. Our son, Owen, grew up in that house. He learned to ride a bike on that driveway. He had his first heartbreak on that back porch. When my wife passed away 4 years ago, breast cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end, I stayed in that house. Some people told me to sell it, that it would be too hard to live there with all those memories. They were wrong. The memories were exactly why I stayed. Every room had her in it. I wasn't ready to let that go. Owen was 31 when she died. He lived in Toronto by then, working in financial technology. The kind of job I never fully understood, but which clearly paid well. He came home for the funeral, stayed 2 weeks, and then went back to his life, which I understood. I told him to go. I told him I was fine. I was fine. For a while. Then he met her. Her name was Vanessa. He brought her home for Thanksgiving in 2023, about 14 months after his mother died. She was 34, worked in marketing, very put together. I made an effort. I made my wife's turkey recipe, the one with the maple glaze and the wild rice stuffing. I set the table properly. I wanted Owen to feel welcome in his childhood home, the way his mother would have wanted. Vanessa was polite that weekend, complimentary about the house. She walked through every room like she was doing an appraisal, but I told myself I was imagining things. They got engaged 6 months later. Owen called me on a Tuesday night, excited, voice higher than usual. I congratulated him. I meant it. I wanted him to be happy. Then he called me again 2 weeks after that. This time his voice was different. Lower, careful, like he was reading from notes. He said Vanessa thought it might make sense for them to move in with me, just temporarily, while they saved for a house of their own. Toronto real estate, he explained. I knew what houses cost. I understood the logic. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. They moved in March of 2024. I gave them the master bedroom, my bedroom, the room my wife and I had shared for 20 years, without them even asking. I moved myself into the second bedroom at the end of the hall. It was a good room. I didn't complain. For the first month, things were manageable. Vanessa worked from home and took over the kitchen table during the day, which meant I took my coffee out to the sunroom. Fine. Owen drove to Toronto 3 days a week and worked remotely the other 2. They were loud at night. Not rudely, just the way young people are. Music and laughing and the television on past 11. I wore earplugs. Fine. Then the small things started. Vanessa asked if I could park my truck in the street instead of the garage because she didn't like backing out around it. I parked in the street. She mentioned that my overrecliner in the living room was an eyesore and she'd found a nice sectional at a place in Kitchener. I moved the recliner to the sunroom. She said the garden needed to be redone because the layout wasn't functional. I had planted that garden with my own hands alongside my wife. I said I'd think about it. Owen noticed none of this. Or if he did, he said nothing. By August, Vanessa had repainted the hallway without asking me. Sage green, she said. Very modern. I stood in my own hallway looking at walls that used to be the soft yellow my wife had chosen in 2004, and I felt something I didn't have a word for at the time. I do now. It was grief with nowhere to go. The first real confrontation happened on a Saturday evening in September. I had come in from the backyard, where I'd been splitting wood for the winter. I was dirty and tired, and I went to my bathroom, the one I'd always used, the small one at the end of the hall, and found it had been converted into a storage room for Vanessa's home office supplies. Printer paper, shipping boxes, a label maker. My toiletries had been moved downstairs to the bathroom of the laundry room. I knocked on the master bedroom door. Owen answered. I said calmly that I needed my bathroom back. Vanessa appeared behind him. She said she'd assumed I wouldn't mind since I spent most of my time on the ground floor anyway. I said I did mind. There was a pause. Owen looked at the floor. Then Vanessa said in a very pleasant voice that perhaps we should all sit down and talk about how the house was being used, since the current arrangement wasn't really working for anyone. I went back to my room and called my lawyer that night. His name was Howard. We'd known each other 20 years, since I needed help with a boundary dispute with a neighbor back in 2003. I told him what was happening, just the broad strokes. He asked me if my son's name was on the deed. I said no. He said I should start keeping notes. I started keeping notes. Over the next 6 weeks, I wrote down dates, times, what was said. I wrote down the morning Vanessa told Owen she wanted to convert my sunroom into a yoga studio. I wrote down the evening Owen asked me, awkwardly, over a dinner I had cooked, whether I had ever thought about downsizing. He said it gently. He called it a practical conversation. He said some of his friends' parents had moved into really nice condos and found it very freeing. I said I would think about it. I was not going to think about it. Then came November. It was a Sunday. I had made a roast chicken, an old habit. I made one almost every Sunday, my whole adult life. The three of us sat down to eat, and I remember the kitchen smelled the way it always did on Sundays. Like thyme and roasted garlic. Like every Sunday my wife and I had spent in that kitchen for 20 years. Owen put down his fork partway through the meal and said he needed to talk to me about something. He said that Vanessa was pregnant. I put down my own fork. I looked at my son's face and I felt something open up behind my sternum. I was going to be a grandfather. Despite everything, despite the creeping wrongness of the past months, that hit me somewhere real. I reached across the table and I put my hand on his arm and I said that was wonderful news. And then Vanessa said that the bedroom I was currently using, the second bedroom at the end of the hall, would need to become the nursery. The room went quiet in a particular way. I said, where would I sleep? Owen didn't answer. He looked at Vanessa. She said they had been thinking about the basement. She said they could set it up nicely. She said the previous owners had used it as a living space. She said it was really quite large. I want to be clear about something. The basement was not a living space. The basement was where my wife had kept her sewing machine and her fabric bins and the Christmas decorations and the old hockey equipment Owen had outgrown in 2001. It had one small window that faced the foundation wall. It did not have a proper egress. According to Ontario's building code, it did not legally qualify as a bedroom. I asked Owen directly, you want your father to sleep in the basement? He said it would only be temporary. I said nothing. I finished my chicken. I helped clear the table. I said goodnight and I went upstairs to my room and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I did not agree to anything that night. 2 weeks later, Owen came to find me in the garage where I was organizing my tools. He sat down on a workbench and he said he needed me to give them an answer. He said Vanessa was stressed about the pregnancy and the living situation, and the uncertainty wasn't good for her. He said he knew it was a lot to ask. I said, Owen, there are 3 other rooms in this house. There's a room across the hall that you're using as a home office. There's a room at the front you're using to store luggage and boxes. Why are those options not on the table? He looked away. He said Vanessa needed the office for work. He said the front room was too small for my furniture. I said, whose name is on the deed for this house? He didn't answer. I said it again very quietly. He said he knew. He said he knew it was my house, but he asked me, his voice cracking slightly, to please do this for his family. He said the baby needed a proper room, a safe room on the same floor as them. He said he was asking me, as my son, to make a sacrifice. I looked at my son's face. I saw the boy who had grown up in that house, who had fallen off his bike on that driveway, who had cried on that back porch. And I also saw a 35-year-old man who had not once, in 8 months of living in my house, asked me how I was doing. I said I would think about it. I said, give me a few days. He thanked me. He went back inside. I went to the far corner of the garage where I keep a small shelf with a few things from my wife. A photo. A small pottery dish she made at a class she took in 2015. Her gardening gloves, still folded the way she left them. I stood there for a few minutes. Then I went inside and I called Howard. What I said to Howard that evening was this: I want to move forward. What I had not told Owen, what I had not told Vanessa, was something Howard had known for 2 years. I owned a second property. When my wife was in her final months, we had long conversations, the kind you have when you know time is short and you want to say everything that matters. One thing she said to me more than once was that she worried about me being alone in that house forever. She said, you need somewhere that's just yours, not ours, yours. 6 months after she died, I found a property about 20 minutes away, a small bungalow on a quiet street in Fergus, backing onto the Grand River. 3 bedrooms, 1 level, a workshop in the backyard. I paid for it in cash from the investment account I'd built over 30 years of working. I had told Owen about neither the account nor the bungalow. They were mine. My wife had told me to have something that was just mine, and I had listened. The week after my conversation with Owen in the garage, I called a real estate lawyer, a different one, recommended by Howard, and I began the process of transferring my primary residence, the farmhouse, into a family trust. Howard had walked me through this option 2 years earlier after the bathroom incident when I first called him. The trust would protect the asset and formalize, legally, that no informal living arrangement could create any kind of claim. Then I did something Owen would not have expected of me. I said yes to the basement. I want to explain that decision because I know how it sounds. I said yes because I wanted Owen to understand something, not from me telling him, but from living it. I said yes because I had 17 years of experience assessing structural risk, and I knew that some things have to play out to their conclusion before anyone can see them clearly. I said yes, and I moved my bed and my dresser downstairs, and I set up that basement with the space heater and the standing lamp, and I said nothing. I lived down there for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, I watched my son's wife repaint my sunroom, which she called the yoga studio, which I'd never agreed to. I watched her bring in 2 of her friends on a Wednesday afternoon and give them a tour of the house as though it were hers. I sat at the bottom of the basement stairs one evening, and I listened to her tell Owen, without knowing I was there, that she thought it was time to look into whether her name could be added to the property so they would have security for the baby. I went upstairs. I said I couldn't help overhearing. The color left her face. I said, I think we should all sit down and have a very clear conversation. Owen looked between us. I said, I've decided I'm going to be moving out. Owen started to say something. I held up my hand. I said, I'm moving to my other property, the one on the Grand River. I've owned it for 3 years. I'll be comfortable there. Owen said, what other property? I said, the bungalow in Fergus. I bought it after your mother died. I've been maintaining it. It's in good shape. The silence in that kitchen lasted a long time. I said, this house will remain in my name, in a family trust, effective as of last Monday. I've spoken with my lawyers. The trust documentation is filed. No one else's name will be added to this property. Vanessa said, you can't just... I said I can. I did. Howard can explain the specifics if either of you have questions. Then I said, I also want to say something to you, Owen, and I'd like you to listen. He nodded. He looked like he was 17 again. I said, I have loved you your entire life. I will love you for the rest of mine. But in the 8 months you've lived here, not once did you ask me how I was managing since your mother died. Not once did you sit with me in the evenings the way we used to. You walked past me in my own house, and you let someone take my bathroom, repaint my walls, and ask me to sleep in a basement so she could have more space. And you called that a sacrifice I should make for my family. He didn't say anything. His eyes were wet. I said, you are my family. You have always been my family. But a family doesn't do this to each other. I went downstairs and I packed my bag. It didn't take long. I had been quietly moving the things that mattered most: the photo of my wife, her pottery dish, her gardening gloves, my tools, to the Fergus bungalow over the previous 2 weeks, one carload at a time, early in the morning before anyone was awake. I drove to Fergus in the dark. The bungalow was warm. I had left the heat on. I stood in the kitchen and I boiled water for tea, and I looked out the window at the Grand River, which was black and moving, and I felt something I hadn't felt since before my wife got sick. I felt like myself. The weeks after that were not simple. Owen called me 4 times in the first week. The first 2 times I didn't answer. The third time, I picked up and I listened. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't understood how far things had gone. He said Vanessa and he had been fighting. I said I was glad he called. I said I needed more time. Howard called me to confirm the trust documentation was in order. He also mentioned, gently, that Vanessa had contacted a family law firm in Kitchener to ask about spousal property rights and common law claims on a residence. Howard said the trust structure made any such claim non-viable. I said I knew. That was why we had moved when we did. The baby was born in the spring, a boy. Owen called me from the hospital, voice shaking, and I could hear something in him that reminded me of the day he fell off his bike and ran inside, and I was the first person he looked for. I drove to the hospital. I held my grandson for the first time in a room that smelled like antiseptic and new life, and I will not pretend that didn't matter more than all the rest of it. Owen and Vanessa are still in the farmhouse. We have an arrangement now, formal and documented, a nominal rent payment, a maintenance agreement, a clear lease that terminates in 2 years and requires them to find their own housing. Howard drafted it. They signed it. It isn't a one document, but it is an honest one. Owen came to the Fergus bungalow for the first time in April. He sat at my kitchen table, and he looked out at the river, and he said, I didn't know she was like that. I didn't see it. I said, I know you didn't. He said, I should have asked how you were doing. I said, yes, you should have. We sat there for a while without talking. The river was high from the spring thaw. There was still snow under the trees on the far bank. My grandson was asleep in the car seat Owen had carried in and set on the floor between us, and his breathing was the only sound in the room. My wife used to say that the structure of a thing tells you where it's going to fail. She meant people as much as buildings. She meant that if you pay attention, really pay attention, you can usually see it coming. She was right. She usually was. I had paid attention. I had kept my name on the deed, my money in my account, and my heart pointed at the things that actually mattered. And when everything settled, I was still standing, on my own ground, in my own home. That, I think, is the only kind of victory worth having. There's a moment I keep coming back to, not the night I drove to Fergus, not the morning I signed the trust documents. It's the Sunday afternoon in my garage, sawdust on my boots, when Owen sat on the workbench and asked me, sincerely, without any visible shame, to please sleep in the basement so his wife could have more space. And I remember thinking, this is not a bad person. This is a person who stopped paying attention. That's what I've come to believe caused all of it, really. Not malice, inattention. Owen had let someone else do his thinking for him, and when you do that long enough, you stop being able to tell the difference between what you actually believe and what you've been told to believe. He didn't wake up one morning and decide his father didn't matter. He just stopped checking, stopped asking. And in that space, something else moved in. I don't say this to excuse him. What happened in that house was wrong. But I've lived long enough to know that when things go badly between people, there's almost always a slow drift before the breaking point. 100 small moments where someone chose comfort over honesty, convenience over courage. Vanessa pushed because she could. Owen let her because it was easier. And I stayed quiet because I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I acted. Not from weakness, from judgment. That's the thing about patience that took me most of my life to understand. It isn't passive. Real patience is active. It's watching, assessing, preparing. My wife used to say I was the most patient person she'd ever known, and she was right. I can sit still for a long time when I need to, but I am always, underneath, figuring out where the load is going. What I did during those 3 weeks in the basement wasn't surrender. It was evidence. I needed Owen to see, not be told, but see, what was actually happening in that house. And I needed it on the record. In my own notes, in Howard's files, in the structure of a trust that no one could undo with a conversation over dinner. I think about what I'd tell someone in a similar position, someone in their 60s who feels the ground shifting under them, who loves their child and can't quite reconcile that love with what their child is doing. I'd say, hold yourself to a standard even when no one else is. Not because it pays off. Sometimes it doesn't, or not right away. But because the alternative is becoming someone you don't recognize. I stayed decent throughout all of it. I cooked Sunday dinners. I shoveled the driveway. I didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't give Vanessa anything she could use against me. And when it mattered, I had the clarity to act cleanly. Owen is a better father now than he was a son. I see it when he holds his boy. When he calls me on a Tuesday for no reason, he learned something he needed to learn, and I think the hardest part for him is knowing what it cost. I don't rub that in. There's no satisfaction in it for me. What I have is the river out my kitchen window, a workshop full of decent tools, and a grandson who is learning to say grandpa. That's the structure that held.